There is no alternative to capitalism. It is literally, the law of nature itself. Secret History of Neoliberalism. And it's by George Monbiot and Peter Hutchison. It comes out June 4th. Friedrich Hayek in 1944. The welfare state and social democracy in general would, through reducing the scope of individual action, eventually mutate into the sort of absolute control exercised by Stalin and Hitler. Again, equating Stalin with Hitler. Another kids' table comment. R.I.P. Bozo. Okay, this is the kind of guy we're dealing with. Friedrich Hayek, who wrote this book espousing all this bullshit. When Friedrich Hayek visited General Pinochet, he visited General Pinochet's Chile in 1981. Remember, Augusto Pinochet was implemented by the CIA in a coup which killed Salvador Allende. A lot of A's in that story. So in 1981, this brutal dictatorship, which had been rolling on for just shy of a decade, he told a journalist that he preferred a liberal dictator to a democratic government devoid of liberalism. So that's revealing. Friedrich Hayek, the champion of capitalism and freedom of the market, says that, you know what? I like going to Chile and seeing what Augusto Pinochet is up to. I prefer this liberal dictator in preference to a democratic government devoid of liberalism. By liberalism, he meant neoliberalism, but by then he would no longer speak its name. Augusto Penis Cheese. So what did this freedom mean in this case? Freedom from trade unions and collective bargaining. Yeah, it's freedom for the capitalists. Freedom for who? That's the overarching question we should all be asking. Freedom for who? Freedom from trade unions. Freedom from collective bargaining means freedom for bosses to suppress wages. Freedom from regulation means the freedom to exploit and endanger workers, to poison rivers, to adulterate food. This is real freedom. To design exotic financial instruments, to charge exorbitant rates of interest. It leads to train wrecks, both literally and figuratively, from the recent string of toxic spill derailments in the American Midwest to the financial meltdowns and bank bailouts we now seem to have accepted as an inevitable fact of economic life. Freedom from taxation, which by definition involves the redistribution of wealth. The freedom from taxation throttles a crucial mechanism to help lift the poor out of poverty. Taxation is by definition a redistribution of wealth. Freedom from taxation throttles a crucial mechanism to help lift the poor out of poverty. The freedom that neoliberals celebrate, which sounds so beguiling when expressed in general terms, turns out to be freedom for the pike, not for the minnows. Freedom for the big guy, not for the little guys. Hayek believed, or claimed to believe, that the market would automatically protect society from tyranny and serfdom. But the market forces he so revered had to be administered, as capitalism had been from the outset, and enforced by the state. So Hayek believed, or claimed to believe, that the market would automatically protect society from tyranny and serfdom. But the market forces that he so revered had to be administered and enforced by the state. Cultural critic Stephen Metcalf points out that this is what makes neoliberalism neo. He argues that previous doctrines such as classical liberalism or laissez-faire economics had promoted, like neoliberalism, a free market and a minimal state. Merchants from the 17th century onward had demanded that governments leave them alone to laissez-faire. But neoliberalism developed in a different era, by which point most adults had the vote. It recognized that in the face of widespread resistance, the state would have to intervene to impose its desired political outcomes on an unwilling population to liberate the market from democracy. Pretty interesting. Money do talk. It do be like that. Yeah, Hayek was a big dumbass. As Naomi Klein showed in her book, The Shock Doctrine, which I hope to one day read. Has anybody read The Shock Doctrine? This is a good book, I think, if you're willing to hear a very well-curated message about neoliberalism, which is the political economy that you live in. You might as well read this book. As Naomi Klein showed in her book, The Shock Doctrine, neoliberalism has often been imposed on people during great crises, at moments when they were too distracted to resist or even notice the new policies that governments were slipping under their doors. It was introduced, for instance, by force in the aftermath of Pinochet's 1973 coup in Chile. It was intensified in the wake of the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 when the U.S. administration captured and privatized the country's assets. It was employed in 2005 in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. That's where I live. That's where I'm standing right now, not far from all the flooded neighborhoods. Augusto Pinochet's coup in Chile is widely seen as inaugurating the global neoliberal era. As the 1970s progressed, neoliberal ideas and policies came increasingly to shape the agendas of international financial institutions, including the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, which imposed neoliberal economics on indebted nations in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. In return for debt relief or loans, structural adjustment programs were demanded, which included privatization, deregulation, trade liberalization, the abandonment of capital controls, and fiscal austerity, which meant slashing state spending on health, education, and other public services. These decisions were imposed without people being given the chance to vote on them. The poorer nations had no choice but to implement them, regardless of what their populations thought. In other words, when neoliberal policies couldn't be imposed democratically, internationally, unwilling nations also found themselves subject to the whims of big business, as offshore courts, presided over by corporate lawyers, sprung up around the world, allowing corporations to sue states if they didn't like the legislation passed by their parliament or Congress. For example, a government or parliament might announce that oil companies will be forbidden from drilling in inshore waters, or that cigarette firms will no longer be allowed to advertise their wares, or that pharmaceutical corporations may no longer charge absurd prices for the drugs they sell to the health service. Regardless of the fact that these decisions were made by elected representatives, the offshore arbitration system known as Investor-State Dispute Settlement, ISDS, allows those aggrieved corporations to sue the nation. That's pretty wild. If the nation loses, their democratic decisions are overturned. So much for national sovereignty. Corporations often emerge with more sovereign power than states. Of course, we know that. According to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD, the total ISDS case count had reached more than 1,100 by the end of 2020, affecting 124 countries. So ISDS, investor state. In several cases, corporations are suing governments for introducing climate policies that diminish the value of investments. We'll sue you! The German energy companies RWE and Uniper have brought claims against the Netherlands, alleging that its proposed phase out of coal power plants was a violation of the Energy Charter Treaty. You can't phase out a coal power. That's in violation of our arbitrary treaty that we created. The Canadian company TC Energy recently initiated a NAFTA legacy claim seeking $15 billion in damages from the U.S. government as a result of its decision to cancel the Keystone Pipeline. The majority of claims are brought by companies based in rich nations and are often imposed upon far weaker countries that have fewer resources with which to defend themselves. The ISDS has become little more than a form of colonial looting by other means. Colonial looting is another thing that I learned from this book. Colonial looting by other means. Yeah, it's just like all these little slings and arrows and economic mechanisms of these, what did he call them? Exotic financial instruments is what he called it earlier in the chapter. It is highly misleading to describe neoliberalism as free market economics. In many ways, it's quite the opposite. Neoliberalism is the tool used by the very rich to accumulate more wealth and power. Neoliberalism is class war. Yeah, and that's the end of chapter 6.
Nixon ordered Cambodian genocide. Sent cruise missiles to Sudan, people died. Gave the orders to do drone strikes.